Imagine being punished, not for theft, not for murder, not for any crime against person or property, but for simply speaking your mind. Picture yourself in a medieval marketplace on a cold morning, where the sound of metal clanging against stone cuts through the autumn mist like a blade through silk. The cobblestones are slick with dew, and a crowd is gathered in the town square, their breath visible in the frigid air as they whisper among themselves. They've come to witness something that will haunt their memories long after the sun sets. In the center of this gathering stands a woman, but she is barely recognizable as human. An intricate cage of iron encases her head, transforming her into a grotesque spectacle of shame and suffering. Her eyes, wide with terror and humiliation, are the only part of her face that remains truly visible. The device that imprisons her is no accident of design. Every spike, every bar, every cruel curve has been crafted with meticulous attention to one singular purpose: to silence her voice forever. What could be so dangerous about a woman's voice that it required iron and steel to silence it? What words could be so threatening to the established order that an entire apparatus of torture was deemed necessary? The answer lies buried in one of history's darkest chapters, where speaking as a woman was not just discouraged, it was criminalized, brutalized, and systematically destroyed. Before we go further into this dark chapter of history, consider subscribing to History Remains. Your support helps us bring more of these untold stories to light. When words became weapons. To understand the horror of what you're about to discover, we must first step back into the shadows of medieval and early modern Europe, spanning the 13th through 18th centuries. This was a world where half the population lived under laws that treated their very voices as instruments of chaos and sin. In this rigid patriarchal society, a woman's speech was not considered a right, but a privilege to be granted or revoked by the men who controlled every aspect of her existence. The legal framework of the time was clear and unforgiving. Laws against scolding, nagging, and disturbing the peace were written with women specifically in mind. These weren't crimes in any modern sense. They were accusations that could be leveled against any woman who dared to speak with authority, passion, or even simple disagreement. Town records from across Europe revealed the systematic nature of this oppression, with women routinely brought before magistrates for the crime of having opinions. The cultural beliefs that supported these laws ran deeper than mere legal text. Society held that women's tongues were inherently sinful and dangerous, capable of spreading corruption like a plague through entire communities. They believed that when women spoke freely, they undermined the natural order ordained by God Himself. These weren't fringe beliefs, they were the foundation upon which entire civilizations built their understanding of gender and power. Religious authorities provided the spiritual justification for this systematic silencing. Biblical passages were twisted and interpreted to support the notion that women should remain silent in all matters of importance. Priests preached from pulpits that a woman's voice was the devil's instrument, capable of leading entire congregations astray with haunted words and dangerous ideas. The Church, the ultimate moral authority of the age, gave its blessing to any method that would restore what they called godly order to their communities. But what happened when women dared to break these unspoken rules? What fate awaited those who refused to be silenced by law, custom, and religious decree? Iron tongues of shame. The answer came in the form of a device so precisely cruel that its very existence reveals the depths of fear that women's voices inspired in their oppressors. The scold's bridle, also known as the brank or gossip's bridle, was an iron framework designed to cage a woman's head like a wild animal. But this was no simple muzzle. It was an instrument of torture engineered with scientific precision to maximize both physical agony and psychological destruction. The device consisted of an iron framework that encased the entire head with metal bands that wrapped around the skull and jaw. Most horrifying of all was the tongue depressor, a flat piece of iron, often spiked or serrated, that was forced into the victim's mouth and pressed down upon her tongue. Some versions included additional spikes that would pierce the tongue if she attempted to move it. while others featured bells attached to the framework that would ring with her every movement, announcing her shame to the world. The earliest documented uses of this barbaric device appeared in Scotland and northern England during the 16th century, though historians suspect its origins may reach back even further into the medieval period. Church records and town chronicles provide chilling accounts of its implementation, describing the device as a necessary tool for maintaining social order and Christian virtue. The fitting process was a ritual of humiliation designed to break a woman's spirit long before the physical torture began. The victim would be brought to the town square, often dragged from her home by neighbors who had accused her of the crime of speech. The iron framework would be placed over her head like a crown of thorns, with the tongue depressor forced into her mouth until she could neither speak nor swallow properly. The device was then locked in place with a key that would be held by the local magistrate or church official. But the physical pain was only the beginning of their suffering. Once secured in the bridal, the victim became a living spectacle, paraded through the streets for hours or even days. Townspeople would follow behind, jeering and throwing refuse, while children were encouraged to point and laugh at the caged woman. The psychological torture was as carefully crafted as the physical device itself, designed to ensure that no woman would ever forget the price of speaking freely. The symbolic meaning was unmistakable. Just as wild horses were bridled and broken to serve their masters, women who spoke out of turn were bridled and broken to serve the social order. The message was clear. A woman's voice belonged not to her, but to the men who controlled her fate. But this was only the beginning of their suffering, voices crushed by convention. The crimes that warranted such brutal punishment revealed the suffocating grip of patriarchal control over every aspect of women's lives. A woman could be sentenced to the bridal for gossiping about her neighbors, arguing with her husband in public, speaking during church services, or engaging in disputes at the marketplace. These were not criminal acts in any meaningful sense. They were the natural expressions of human beings trying to participate in their own communities. Court records from 16th century England provide haunting documentation of these cases. One particularly well-preserved account tells the story of Agnes Dalton, a market vendor, who was sentenced to wear the bridle for 3 consecutive market days after she publicly disputed a merchant's dishonest scales. Her crime was not theft or fraud, but rather the audacity to point out injustice when she witnessed it. The records note that she was forced to wear the device from dawn until dusk, unable to eat or drink while conducting her business under the watchful eyes of the town authorities. The connection between outspoken women and accusations of witchcraft was no coincidence. Throughout the witch trials that swept across Europe, investigators noted that many accused women shared one common trait: they had previously been punished for speaking their minds. The transition from scold to witch was often seamless, as communities sought more permanent solutions to women who refused to be silenced. Historical records show that women who had worn the bridle were 3 times more likely to face witchcraft accusations within 5 years of their punishment. Economic motivations lurked beneath the surface of these seemingly moral crusades. When women spoke up about unfair business practices, challenged price manipulation, or organized other women to demand better treatment, they threatened the economic interests of the male-dominated merchant class. Silencing these voices protected not just social order, but financial profits. The bridle became a tool of economic oppression, disguised as moral enforcement. Yet, even in the face of such brutal punishment, some women found ways to resist. Historical accounts tell of women who learned to communicate through gestures and written messages while bridled, or who organized silent protests by gathering together in bridled solidarity. Others found allies among sympathetic community members who would provide food and water to bridled women when authorities weren't watching. These small acts of rebellion demonstrate that even in the darkest periods of oppression, the human spirit finds ways to resist and survive. Yet the bridle was not the only weapon in their arsenal of silence, a gallery of suppression. As word of the scold's bridal's effectiveness spread throughout Europe, communities began developing their own variations, each more cruel and humiliating than the last. In Scotland, the branks evolved to include iron spikes that would pierce the thumb and inner cheeks if the victim attempted to speak, while small bells were attached to announce her movements to anyone within hearing distance. These bells served a dual purpose. They prevented any possibility of discreet movement while simultaneously drawing attention to her shame. The gossip's bridle, popular in northern England, featured an extended faceplate that completely obscured the victim's features, reducing her to a faceless symbol of silenced womanhood. Some versions included grotesque decorations, demon faces, serpents, or other symbols of evil designed to associate the wearer with sin and corruption in the minds of onlookers. Regional differences reflected local attitudes toward women's speech, with some areas favoring maximum physical pain while others focused on psychological humiliation. Alternative punishments worked alongside the bridle to create a comprehensive system of voice suppression. The ducking stool, another device specifically designed for scolds, would plunge women repeatedly into freezing water until they nearly drowned. Public stocks exposed women to hours of physical abuse from community members. These punishments weren't random acts of cruelty. They were part of a coordinated campaign to eliminate women's voices from public discourse entirely. Church records and town chronicles from across Europe document the systematic implementation of these devices. Priests blessed the instruments before their use, while magistrates kept detailed records of which women had been punished and for what offenses. This bureaucracy of oppression reveals the institutional nature of women's silencing. It wasn't the work of individual sadists, but rather the coordinated effort of entire societies. The practice spread with European colonization, finding fertile ground in the American colonies, where Puritan beliefs about women's proper place aligned perfectly with these medieval traditions. Colonial records show that scolds' bridles were imported from England and used regularly in settlements from Massachusetts to Virginia. The New World became another stage for this ancient drama of voice suppression. The psychological impact on entire communities was profound and lasting. Women learned to modulate their voices, to speak only when spoken to express disagreement through subtle gestures rather than direct words. The mere sight of a bridle hanging in a town square was enough to silence dozens of potential voices. Children grew up believing that women's speech was inherently dangerous, perpetuating cycles of oppression that would last for generations. But what finally brought an end to these instruments of repression? Echoes of silence. The decline of the scold's bridle came not through sudden moral awakening, but through the slow, grinding progress of Enlightenment thinking that began to question the very foundations of traditional authority. As philosophers like Mary Wollstonecraft began articulating arguments for women's rational capacity and inherent rights, the legal justifications for speech-based punishments grew increasingly difficult to defend. The rise of literacy among women also played a crucial role. It became harder to argue that women lacked the intellectual capacity for meaningful discourse when they were producing literature, correspondence, and political treatises. Legal reforms moved slowly across Europe throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. England officially abolished the use of scold's bridles in 1824, though unofficial use continued in rural areas for decades afterward. The last recorded official use occurred in 1856 in the Scottish town of Down, where a woman named Kate Ronaldson was bridled for publicly arguing with her neighbor. Even as late as the 1870s, American newspapers reported isolated instances of bridal use in rural communities, suggesting that the practice died hard in areas where traditional authority remained strong. The social evolution that finally ended these practices was gradual but irreversible. As women gained access to education, property rights, and eventually political participation, the notion that their voices were inherently dangerous began to crumble. The Industrial Revolution also played a role, as economic necessity forced societies to recognize women's contributions to public life.
When women's labor became essential to industrial production, their complete silencing became economically counterproductive. Today, surviving examples of scold's bridals can be found in museums across Europe and North America, silent testaments to a darker age. The Museum of London, the National Museum of Scotland, and dozens of smaller institutions preserve these devices, often displaying them alongside explanatory text that struggles to convey the full horror of their systematic use. These artifacts serve as physical reminders of how quickly civil rights can disappear when societies decide that certain voices are too dangerous to be heard. The historical significance of these devices extends far beyond their immediate use. They represent one of history's most systematic attempts to eliminate half the human population from public discourse. The bridal was not an aberration or an extreme response to extreme behavior. It was the logical conclusion of a worldview that saw women's voices as inherently threatening to social stability. Yet modern parallels persist in subtler forms. Women's voices are still interrupted more frequently in meetings, dismissed more readily in public forums, and criticized more harshly when they express anger or disagreement. The iron cages are gone, but the impulse to silence women's voices remains embedded in cultural patterns that echo across centuries. But the question remains, have we truly learned from this dark chapter? The price of speaking truth? As we emerge from this journey through one of history's darkest chapters, we must grapple with the uncomfortable truth that the systematic silencing of women's voices was not an accident of history, but a deliberate choice made by entire civilizations. The scold's bridal and its variations were not tools of justice. They were instruments of oppression designed to maintain power structures that benefited from women's silence. The courage displayed by the women who endured these punishments cannot be overstated. Every woman who spoke truth to power, knowing full well the consequences that awaited her, demonstrated a form of heroism that history has largely forgotten. They paid with their bodies, their dignity, and sometimes their lives for the simple act of having a voice. Their sacrifice paved the way for every woman who speaks freely today. The lessons embedded in this history extend far beyond gender relations. They remind us that the right to speak, to dissent, and to participate in public discourse is never guaranteed. Every generation must actively defend these rights against those who would prefer a more convenient silence. The methods may evolve, but the impulse to silence inconvenient voices remains a constant threat to human dignity. These stories matter in our modern context because they illuminate the foundations upon which our current freedoms rest. Every woman who speaks in a boardroom, every female voice raised in protest, every girl who dreams of changing the world stands on the shoulders of those who endured the bridal's iron embrace. Their suffering was not in vain if we remember their lessons and remain vigilant against the return of such systematic oppression. Which aspect of these medieval punishments disturbs you most? The physical cruelty inflicted upon individual women, or the systematic silencing of half the population that denied entire societies the benefit of women's voices, perspectives, and wisdom? Share your thoughts below and help us understand how we can ensure that these dark chapters of history are never repeated.